All right, I apologize for the fact that we're getting started a little late tonight, and it's not our fault, but nonetheless, here we are. I want to introduce Philip Zelikow. Thank him for coming. He's the White Burkett Miller Professor of History at the University of Virginia. I'm sure, know his work as the director of the 9/11 Commission staff, which produced the 9/11 Commission report, perhaps the only presidential commission that has ever been a bestseller, and a graphic novel, I might add. Not a novel, I should say, graphic nonfiction. But one of the striking things about it, as I'm sure many of you already know, is that it reads in parts like a novel. And one thing that we've learned since it came out is how it is that it was the express intention from the outset to create a report that wouldn't read like a report, but would read already as history, and the best kind of history, the kind of history that was true to life, and that would provide a compelling account of these events in a way that would imprint itself on the public imagination and the way people had just begun to come to terms with these tragic events. And I think that historians took some pride, in the fact that this was the work of an historian, and also of a number of historians in assisting him in this work, because in effect it was a demonstration of the power of history and the importance of history, because then as now, and perhaps forever, there will be many who would look back at these events very differently, who would find it too hard to believe that these tragic events could be the work of a relatively small number of people on both sides, people making terrible mistakes with terrible consequences, who preferred to believe that it was an even smaller number of people, perhaps, who were orchestrating all of it. And if you think of the importance of history in part as helping people understand the world as it is and how it came to be that way, then I think you would agree that our speaker tonight, Philip Zelikow, has been on the front lines in that fight for history. And I want to thank him again for coming. He's going to be speaking tonight about the uses of history. I hope he'll speak about some of the history that I was just talking about. But I know, too, he's going to be talking about the larger agenda for this research program, coming to terms with transnational, even global problems. And finally, before I let him take the podium, let me just once again thank the people who made all this possible. I want to thank again Roger Hertog for his generosity in creating this initiative. I want to thank, too, the Arnold Saltzman Institute for co-sponsoring this lecture series, and finally the School of International and Public Affairs for providing us with this venue. So thank you, and thank you all for coming.
What I'd like to do is to start out with a story about how one particular country decided to build an atomic bomb. I've chosen to focus on uses of history with respect to nuclear weapons and the issue of nuclear proliferation, because that's a theme for this speaker's program and for the Hertog Global Strategy Seminar this summer. And the particular country I'm going to start with, the particular country I'm going to tell my little story about, is actually a story we should know reasonably well. It's the story of how the United States of America chose to build the atomic bomb. I think it's an interesting story. This is, in principle, the story we should understand better than any other. And so when I looked at this story a little bit, I was actually surprised that there is a lot of questions and mysteries surrounding this story. Now, there are a lot of books about the building of the atomic bomb, like Richard Rhodes's book and several others. They're very good books. The conventional narrative about this story is basically the U.S. government discovers that there are these amazing things that can be done. Scientists are organized under the leadership of a blustery colonel promoted to general and as an incentive for him to take the job of having to manage all these unruly scientists. And so General Leslie Groves and J. Robert Oppenheimer put together the team, and they overcome myriad scientific challenges, and they build the bomb. And the central protagonists in the conventional narrative of the building of the bomb are Groves and Oppenheimer, or the nuclear scientists, and all the challenges they overcome. And in the Rhodes book, it's basically a narrative about the scientists discovering the potential, and then overcoming the challenges, and then wrestling with the moral and ethical implications of what they're doing. But one of the things that this narrative misses is how interesting and odd that it was that the United States chose to do this at all. There were several countries during the Second World War that looked at the issue of whether to try to build an atomic bomb. In addition to the United States, Nazi Germany looked at it, the Soviet Union looked at it, Britain looked at it and then basically shrugged their shoulders and turned the problem over to the United States. Japan looked at it just a tiny bit, had a few scientists who understood it a little bit. All of them but the United States basically said too hard and did not mount a serious effort to build the bomb until actually the United States had already proven that it could be done. And then once the whole world had seen a proof of concept, then others were more motivated. So actually the United States was unique, alone, in deciding to make an all-out effort to build an atomic bomb. Let me just emphasize this phrase, all-out effort. If you don't make an all-out effort, you don't build an atomic bomb. The effort to build the atomic bomb was the most expensive industrial engineering project ever undertaken by the United States of America to that time. It was a vast project. It made incredible claims on the resources of the country, even at one point a non-trivial fraction of the entire electricity supply of the country. So a fantastically expensive effort. And the decision was made to do this in order to build a weapon that no one had ever proven would work. Now, how many of you know of military programs that will basically spend unlimited amounts of money on concepts that have actually never even been proven in a laboratory? Make the most colossal bet the richest country in the world can possibly make on an entirely unproven concept. And it was unique in doing that. And by the way, I'll even add that I think had the United States not built an atomic bomb during the Second World War, it's actually not clear to me when or possibly even if an atomic bomb ever is built, because of this tremendous effort someone had to muster under simply incredible emergency, extraordinary conditions to overcome all these hurdles to prove it could be done and do it. Because to most people who looked at it, this is kind of it's an intriguing theoretical idea, but it's just not practical. So then a good question to turn to is, when exactly was the decision made to do this as an all-out project? When was that decision made? My judgment of this focuses to just pick 1 month, September 1942. By the way, this interesting decision is not the decision that, gee, let's conduct research on an atomic bomb project. Once you find out that theoretically this can be done, the decision to set up a research program is not a hard decision. The decision even to set up an R&D program, like we ought to have some people who kind of are working on this. That's also not a hard decision. The hard decision is, let's put this into production and give it the highest priorities and claims on all resources of the United States, if necessary, trumping all other claims. By the way, in the image of the United States is we had so much stuff, we could do anything. We didn't have to make hard choices. Wrong. We were making hard choices all over the place. No, there wasn't that much steel in the United States to be able to do everything. And I'll come back to just what kind of hard choices were being made the same time this decision was being made. So the when, let's say September 1942, that's actually when the decision is made to create the Manhattan Engineering District, to put it into a full-scale production, to give it the priorities in the Army-Navy Munitions Board that would allow it the access to the raw materials that, by the way, it had not been getting for the previous 6 months. And had been claiming again and again, can we please have this steel, can we please have this, and had been told, no, you can't. Mainly being told no by General Lucius Clay, who was actually a fairly senior figure in the Army. And, well, we're going to get Vannevar Bush after you. Okay. The answer is still no, Clay would say. This all changed in September 1942. And then they just put Leslie Groves in charge, the most hard-charging engineering officer they know of in the U.S. Army, who had just finished building the Pentagon for them. And so the first question is when. Second question is, who made this decision? By the way, not Leslie Groves, not J. Robert Oppenheimer, not any atomic scientist. So who actually makes this decision? By the way, anyone know the answer to this question? There are at least 5 key names, 4 that you could think of, maybe 6 or 7. One of them is not Franklin Roosevelt, who is, however, generally very supportive. You know, we have like written evidence of like a forward note he wrote at some point saying, "Go ahead with this." But like that's in 1941, where he's been told this is an interesting idea, and Roosevelt said, "Yeah, pursue it." This decision is made. The 4 people I would single out are Henry Stimson, George Marshall, Vannevar Bush, James Conant, and then if you stretched a little bit more, working for Stimson, a man named Harvey Bundy, and Robert Patterson, another person working for Marshall named Steyer, another person working for Marshall very important, named Brown Somerville, who runs the boring part of the Army that deals with supply, which means kind of buying everything for the Army, which was actually kind of a big job at that time. So, but that's basically the people who make this. They actually are on a special committee that's working on the atomic project called an S1 committee. And, but actually, if you look into why they made this decision, it's actually it's not hard to find really good evidence on this point. They didn't write much stuff down about it. I mean, we have good evidence that up to about a certain point, they're asking again and again for materials that they need and are basically being told, no, we're not going to give you the AA priority you want. You have to stand in line with all the others. We're not going to quit building a whole, armored division worth of tanks so that you can build your cockamamie thing. Just to help put this in perspective, no one at this point in September 42 had even ever done a chain reaction. The Fermi pile in Chicago produced the first chain reaction that even proved that principle was theoretically possible. They'd actually done it. They didn't do that until December of 1942. So at the point this decision is made, no one has even produced a chain reaction even in a laboratory setting. Why did they make this decision in September 1942? Why did this group of people, who were not kind of notorious casino gamblers, make about the most colossal gamble it's imaginable for them to make? That's actually fairly interesting. And let me now give you a little more context about some stuff that's going on at the time. One of the things that's going on at the time is this is actually a period of crisis in American war production. If you read the official histories, it's interesting, the atomic histories just do the atomic history. Then the histories of, say, the building up the Army ground forces, they just do the history of the Army ground forces. They don't really notice that, hey, that decision's being made at the same time as that decision is being made at that decision. Here's what's happening, is basically the American Armed Forces put together a victory plan in 1941 that says, here's the way we're going to build up the Army and the Navy and the Air Corps to win the war. I mean, basically, here's how big it's going to be, and therefore here's how many people we're going to need, and here's how much stuff we need to buy. Here's how many training camps we need to build. You can just see how important these decisions are in terms of all the things that would flow from these decisions. And their basic plan is we're going to build a gigantic army. It's going to be an army that's going to have about 200 divisions. We're going to build a gigantic Air Corps, and we're going to build a gigantic Navy. And then by about the summer of 1942, they realize that they cannot do it all. They just can't have it all. There just aren't enough people. There aren't enough resources to do it all. And actually, they're going to have to make really big cuts, not like 5 or 10% at the margin cuts across the board. They're going to have to make some really big strategic choices to change the plan, how they're going to win the war. By the way, the big army plan was totally natural to them. America had mobilized for all-out war. This is the 3rd time it had happened in the history of the country. And the American way of war is established by the first time, which was Grant on Richmond. And Grant on Richmond is get the biggest army you can and just bludgeon the other guy until they are bloody and lying on the ground. And you just win a war of attrition and you win. And so the next time they mobilized for all-out war, which is in the First World War, we built the largest army we could and shipped 2 million people to France to fight it. We didn't even bother so much about getting the artillery for them or getting planes for them. We bought all that stuff from the British and French, who were happy to sell it. We mainly just got the soldiers there, because we were just going to get such an overwhelming number of soldiers there, and the British and French would help equip them, and that was going to turn the tide of the war. And they were going to do the same thing again. Third time around is we're going to need an overwhelming, because we're going to actually have to beat the Wehrmacht in Europe. Because Marshall's preferred plan for how to win the war is we're going to have to land in France and put the biggest goddamn army we can field into the field, and we're going to have to beat the Wehrmacht and win the war. And there's no fancy tap dancing way around it. That was his approach. By September 1942, every aspect of that plan is falling apart. The basic plan to get ashore in Europe and immediately open a second front in France, in part in order to desperately hope to somehow keep the Germans from winning the war in Russia, which they feared the Germans were going to win in 1942. That's collapsed. Marshall is so angry about the collapse of that he wants to actually, in July of 42, he asks Roosevelt, so, well, if we're not going to do this seriously, let's just switch our whole main effort to the Pacific and abandon Germany first. And Roosevelt vetoes that and says, no, we're going to do something in that theater, and more or less forces Marshall, very much against his will, to adopt the plan, well, we'll do this invasion in North Africa, in western North Africa, which will mount later in 1942, even though we know that means that it compromises our ability to do a cross-channel attack even in 1943. And there's a lot written on a lot of this strategic turmoil of the summer of 1942. At the same time that the main strategy for coming to grips with the enemy is beginning to dissolve, the army, the giant army that was going to do it, they can't do that and have the Air Corps and have the Navy. Something's got to give. And the decision that they make, which they make in the fall of 1942 and then is gradually put into effect in early 43, is what Army historians have called the 100 division gamble. Is what they did is they basically cut the planned size of the Army in half. In half. Instead of a 200 division Army, we're going to go for 100. Actually, it will end up being only about 88. We will not cut the size of the Navy at all. We will not cut the size of the Air Corps at all. Same number of groups for the Air Corps, same number of carriers, battleships, and ships for the Navy. So it was not kind of a lowest common denominator. They made a strategic choice. We're going to take it pretty much all out of the Army's hide. Underneath that, you're saying there is clearly some kind of concept underneath that decision about how it is we're now going to win World War II. That's different from the concept they had 6 months earlier. Yeah, there is. And now I'd remind you again that that's the same period of time in which they authorized the A-bomb project. You're beginning to sense something here. What else is going on? A couple of other things. They are told that the science on this is compelling. None of these people, as I said earlier, are atomic scientists. Why is it that they are so willing to make a colossal bet on unproven science? Is because clearly someone whom they trust utterly has told them to place all your chips on that number. Who is that person? That person probably above all is Vannevar Bush, who is not probably a very well-known person. He is the head of, at that time, of something called the Office of Scientific Research and Development in the United States government. He is, in effect, he's an unusual person. He is not a nuclear physicist. He's not actually a physicist at all. But he is a scientist. And he, in effect, has become the ambassador of the world of science to the world of practical men. And I'm afraid they pretty much are all men in 1942. And somehow, Bush has just gotten a relationship built up where if Bush says, put your bet on that, the Army guys say, yes, Mr. Bush, that's what we'll do, because we trust you. He had built up a credibility with them as someone who could bridge these two worlds, that they believed he understood practical problems, and that if he told them to bet on something, they were going to bet on it. So Bush is coming up with things like, let's put this kind of emphasis on something called proximity fuses. Let's put this kind of effort on the radar effort, and so on. And a number of other innovations. And Bush has this remarkable role in that they trust him. He's developed such a high-quality relationship, and there's a relationship, too, with Harry Hopkins and with President Roosevelt, that Bush can vouch for this. And Bush, in turn, relies a lot on Jim Conant, who is the president of Harvard University, who is himself not a key atomic scientist, but who understands more of the physics and understands it well enough that he feels he can calibrate it more, and he is seized with it. What happens if you take Bush and Conant out of the picture? I mean, we actually could see what had happened, because there were earlier versions of this as a research project in our government in which it was utterly languishing for months and months and months, moving about a centimeter at a time. And even earlier in 1942, we can kind of see the way it was going as an R&D project, in which case there's no chance there would have been a bomb developed by the end of World War II, if indeed one had ever been developed at all. So there's an unusual, it's not just the science, it's the way the science is represented to the halls of power and the credibility that had. And by the way, it's possible that Bush and Conant could have been wrong. But it just turns out that they weren't in this particular case. And there's also a sense of, and that which Bush and Conant push very hard, is this is not only a possible way to win the war, but it's also a possible way to lose it. Because we think the Germans are working on this. Actually, they thought the Germans were probably way ahead of them, because most of this work had originated in Germany. And the key guys who they thought were smarter than their guys were in Germany. They thought Heisenberg was better than anyone on their team. And actually, Thomas Powers' argument in his book, Heisenberg's War, it's a controversial argument, but he basically argues that the Germans for sure would have gone for this if Heisenberg basically hadn't been deliberately reticent. And playing just the opposite role of Vannevar Bush, instead of basically pushing it, he actually was pulling and being reticent. And so it didn't go anywhere. Interestingly, the judgment that the Germans are working on this is a misjudgment. They're actually wrong about that. Unbeknownst to them, the Germans have more or less decided not to go all out on this in the summer of 1942. But in September of 1942, the U.S. government, maybe fortunately, maybe unfortunately, according to your lights, doesn't know that. And so that's a factor. But in my view, still not the only factor, but a factor. Because I think still the key factor is, what's your theory of how you're going to win the war? This is no longer a theory that relies on the brute force of the U.S. Army to carry the day. This is clearly a theory that relies on naval power as your supreme enabler everywhere. And then air power, you're still going to bet heavily on air power. There's been some very good work that's done on where did we get this cultural belief that air power was a potential war winner. Tammy Biddle has written on this. Michael Sherry has written on this. It's very interesting work. One of the points, too, is that this is very much a cultural belief that is entirely also pretty much unproven. Indeed, 1942 is a bad year for the Air Force advocates. Actually, all the strategic bombing arguments have been doing very badly in 1942. They've done badly in 41 for the British. They're doing badly in 1942, and 1943 they will do even worse. Unbeknownst to them, in 1943, the strategic bombardment offensive will basically fail pretty spectacularly. By the end, actually, even at the end of 42, they have to make a strategic call going into the Casablanca conference on, are we really going to keep relying heavily on the air campaign? And instead of basically pulling back from it, they double the bet. And then have a terrible year in 1943 in which it doesn't work at all, until all of a sudden they figure out how to solve the problem in early 1944. And actually, that's when that bet begins to prove out, because frankly, they developed long-range fighter escorts above all the P-51 Mustang, and then deployed it in numbers in early 1944, and then that dramatically changed the whole air power equation over Europe. But that's kind of a digression and a different story. The point is they have a theory of how to win the war that's also substantially conjectural, and actually most of the empirical evidence available to them then and for some time is against it. It's, embedded in that theory too is, and what's going to happen to the Wehrmacht? And part of that theory is the Red Army is going to bleed the Wehrmacht. And so embedded in that is also an assessment of how do we think the Red Army is going to do, and is Russia likely to survive without us? And they are coming to a judgment by the fall of 1942 that they think Russia is not going to collapse. They don't necessarily foresee Stalingrad coming. Neither did the Germans, because the Germans and us, we didn't actually see where the Russians were going to get another group of armies from. And actually, which is another interesting story, because it's amazing that they actually could scrape another group of armies together, but they did, and that made a big difference. But so the point is, when you unpack this judgment, this is a judgment in which you're saying, instead of the whole way we've been developing our armed forces to win wars, what Russell Weigley had once called the American way of war, which is all about brute force, we're going to rely on brute force, but in a totally different way. We're going to rely a lot on death from above. We're going to leverage our high technology advantages. You don't look back at World War I and see, hey, that's America leveraging its high technology advantages. No, it was using its farm boys and letting the British and French supply the high technology, thank you. So this is a different concept. This will turn out to be a fateful decision, enormously fateful decision, because the design of the American armed forces that they put in place in 42, 43 will be the design of the American armed forces for the next 50 years. That fundamental condition in which you have a relatively weak army and you rely heavily on high technology, above all air power, above all armed with amazing weapons to win your wars for you, is a pattern that will be grooved deeply into the habits of thought and culture of the American armed forces, and is to this day. It will structure the entire military balance in Europe during the Cold War, which is structurally always one of big red army facing smaller allied armies offset by air power and nuclear weapons, which will be a source of constant tension and instability and difficulty through the Cold War as well. And a lot of that is embedded in this story that I've just been describing to you. So now I think that's an interesting story in its own right. So I think there's an interesting story in why America chose to make an all-out effort to build the atomic bomb. And I've tried to suggest to you that I think that if you had been making an intelligence assessment about whether or not America would do this in, say, spring 1942, and certainly in 1941, you would have been pretty hard-pressed to make a really good argument as to why for sure we were going to do this. Okay, I think that's fair to say. Indeed, even in September 42, it might not have seemed like an obvious call. And it's the product of a particular configuration of personalities and circumstances, which I've tried to unpack a little bit. And I must tell you, I can't point today to actually a single scholarly work that, to my view, adequately recounts the story. And this is the one we know best. All right. So I wanted to introduce that story for you and spend a few minutes on it, because I want to make only one other point to you in this talk. The other point I want to make in the talk is, how do we reason from history? Let's, mainly the way we reason from history about a problem like nuclear proliferation is there are basically two styles of reasoning. One of them is analogical and the other is direct. The analogical style of reasoning would go something like this. Let's take the case of, Iran. Iran, that's a familiar case. So the analogical version would be, we can deter Iran because deterrence of Iran is like ... fill in the blank. Deterrence in the Cold War, deterrence of China, deterrence of... We have various analogies of deterrence, and we think those analogies worked or did not work. And therefore, if those analogies worked or did not work, we form a generalization about whether deterrence works. We then apply that generalization to Iran. That's called analogical reasoning. In my view, this form of reasoning is deeply deficient and highly suspect and extremely common, and terribly seductive because it's the most common form of reasoning in public affairs, usually unacknowledged, usually implicit. And actually, there are versions of this, often kind of half-hidden, but usually not very, are all around you. If you read the literature on the Iran story, it's everywhere, on the Iran policy arguments. Or another version of the analogical reasoning could be, here Iran believes such and such and such and such. Well, the Iran case is like, or Iran's ambitions or Iran fears about Iran are like. well, let's say Iran is like Red China. We were very worried about Red China, and that seemed really wild and irrational in the 1950s or early 1960s. Well, maybe Iran is like that. And maybe they're not even as wildly irrational as the Chinese seem to us. And then in principle, the supposition is maybe we can be a little more relaxed about Iran because, you know, we could have been a little more relaxed about China, it turns out. Or you could then say, no, Iran is like Hitler's Germany. And you wouldn't want to, maybe you wouldn't have felt very comfortable if Hitler had acquired an atomic bomb. Maybe you'd be uneasy about that. And so I'll use that analogy. Imagine if Hitler had an atomic bomb, that's like Ahmadinejad, then there's another version of an analogy. Okay? These are all styles of analogical reasoning, uses of history in that way. Then there are versions of direct historical reasoning. Direct historical reasoning is usually found when someone has called upon a certified Iran expert to write on the subject. So the typical Iran expert will then write something that says, here is Iran's history with the United States or with the region. This has been a bad history. There have been quarrels. There has been mutual suspicion and fear and loathing. And therefore, Iran, you know, has a historical tradition of believing this or that. And if we kind of trace Iranian historical traditions, it's always kind of naturally wanted to be this. It's always kind of naturally wanted that. And we can therefore try to project from these traditions, from these patterns, from these habits of mutual fear and suspicion that turn out to be exaggerated on each side, one or another belief about how we would project Iran to behave in the future, based on, you know, the projection and understanding of how Iran has behaved in the past, or even on Iran's behavior with other weapons in the past or other situations, you know. So that's more direct knowledge, is we're going to look at the history of the case at hand, the history of Iran, and we're going to try to project forward from that history or develop generalizations about what Iran wants or doesn't want from that history. All right? Now let's suppose we applied that same style of reasoning to the case I just spent all this time introducing to you about America and its decisions on the atomic bomb in 1942. Notice I think I can fairly notice how you would have gotten almost no valuable insight whatever from any of it. You would have, if you had tried analogical reasoning in doing the case on the United States in 1941, 1942, I don't know where you get from that. I mean, people could have tried to, the United States in 41, 42 is like what? I mean, see, there weren't even actual good analogies of the United States behaving this way in its major wars. So it's hard to say, well, you know, I suppose, gee, the Union did develop balloons in the Civil War. You see, okay. Suppose you had done just direct history. I'll just do a historical study of American national security traditions and figure out the most likely theory in which how is America likely to try to win this war? What weapons will it likely rely on? What strategies will it likely adopt? If I was working in German military intelligence in summer of 1942 and trying to project the likely shape, weight, and direction of American military power that would be wielded against them. And I think you could get somewhere with that. I think that would be of some value. But as far as shedding a lot of light on the particular story I just told, I think it's very hard. So if you were to look at the Iran case today, and someone was asking me earlier today, if you wanted to do a study of Iran today, what would be an example of how you would work on Iran? I said, well, let's take a historical case on Iran. Let's just discard the analogical reasoning altogether. And let's just say that we wanted to do some direct historical work on Iran. We actually know of a particular decision Iran has made about nuclear matters that was very significant. Iran made the decision to quit the moratorium and resume uranium enrichment. It appears to have made that decision no later than sometime in 2004. That's a decision we know they made. It's a decision we know they thought was significant. So then you would think, if you use my example of the American case, and you think about the level of detail I needed to get into to try to explain that case to you, and say, okay, then what level of detail would I need to get into to be comparably, have a stab at being comparably insightful about Iran? That's like, when, who, why. When did Iran make that decision about resuming uranium enrichment? And then, to the best of my knowledge, can I bound that time frame, to one degree or another? Who exactly made it? I mean, actually make a list of the names and the positions they held and the institutional environment in which they operated. See, like Vannevar Bush as an atomized name, you have to understand who is Vannevar Bush, what are his concerns, what's his world, what is the Office of Scientific Research and Development. But part of it is the personal relationships he has, right, as opposed to, say, a Werner Heisenberg. So you would want to look at the names, and then who are these people? And what is the institutional environment in which they specifically operated at that time? And what are the different relationships and so on? And then why did they make that decision? And then, of course, you wouldn't want to just look at the whys having to do with atomic issues. What were all the concerns in those people's heads at that point in time? What were all the assessments they would have made? Notice in the American case, there were a whole lot of other issues going on there that they were weighing and calculating, most of them not having to do with atomic matters, because the people who actually made that decision, none of them were doing atomic research. They had some representations about the state of atomic research being made to them by others that they chose to believe. So you begin to think about that kind of level of analysis that you then apply to that case, and I think you begin to surface then the character of the problem in analyzing a case like, say, the Iranian case. I mean, I've had to work on a little bit of this problem myself in the real world, because when I was in government the last time as counselor of the Department of State in 2005 and 2006, I was very much concerned with Iraq. And I was very much concerned with why is Iran doing so much to intervene in the Iraqi conflict and kill American soldiers? And the Iranians were doing this in a big way. And this is a subject of some concern, because if Iranians are intervening in this war and Iranians are directly responsible for killing Americans, well, gee, we usually do something when people kill our soldiers. We usually do something to the people who are doing that. And I actually visited and I saw for myself what they were doing to our soldiers. And if you do that, you're going to want to do something about it and do something to the people who are making it happen. So I spent a lot of time trying to figure out who is making these decisions in Iran. And these decisions are significant decisions in which substantial resources were invested. There was some flurry of controversy about this back when it finally surfaced publicly. No, they couldn't be doing it. That controversy, I think, now has subsided. I mean, the evidence on this is overwhelming. It was not cooked up by politicos in the White House. It was very much a ground-up stuff being done by the forensics of the soldiers who were encountering these weapons in the field and then working them back. And of course, we've actually captured Hezbollah operatives who were imported from Lebanon for training in Iranian camps and then deployed from the Iranian camps for combat inside Iraq, killing Americans. And we know a little bit about Iranian tactical management of the kill operations and things like that. So you ask, why are they doing this? Who's doing this? Why are they doing it? How can we influence their calculations on this point? And I will tell you that from my experience in working these issues, I found them very humbling, because actually we don't know very much about who's making these decisions. I'll tell you what you do know, and what is humbling is, boy, the more you know about this, the more you know you do not understand their world. And their world is a very distinctive world. It is not the world of, quote, Iran. It is even, in some ways, not even the world of the Iranian Revolutionary Guards Corps, which itself is a very distinctive institutional and organizational culture. It is even parts and subsets within that world of factions of people who've known each other for a long time, who've gone back and have done a lot of things together. And they've been involved in they've suffered a lot of brutal things together, and they've done a lot of brutal things together. These are people who have themselves personally killed other people in various operations, in different places. This is a tough group of folks, and they pride themselves in their toughness. It's a badge of honor to them. It says, we know how to do tough things, unlike some people. Unlike these soft foreigners we sometimes encounter. I mean, we're tough guys, and they're not. And they have a very particular view of the world, and it varies to some extent among them. And actually, they talk a lot about their view of the world in different ways, because they have to talk to each other. And there's a spectrum of views about that. But the more I got into that, and of course these are mostly people who aren't very well traveled, who don't know a whole lot about the outside world, and what they do know comes to them through very unusual prisms, refracted in very interesting ways. And so kind of constructing, what do they believe is going on in the world? What kind of action judgments are they making? I just found this is just extremely hard to understand. And so I'm humbled by it, and I feel very modest about it. But then that then takes me back to, then how do you deal with situations of modesty and uncertainty and risk? And that's an important theme in all of these stories. Notice even back in the American story that I was talking about, how much is involved even in the American judgments about conjecture, about risks, about what risks they're prepared to accept. You know, that 100-division gamble they made for the Army actually almost does not pay out. They actually, by early 1945, we actually ran out of combat soldiers. I mean, ran out of combat soldiers. They began scraping the rear areas in England and even back in the States. First of all, by early 44, they had a program that the college kids can get extra training first because we want to keep all our college kids from being killed. They scrapped that in early 44 and just threw the college kids into the line. By early 45, they're even, my God, enlisting Negro soldiers on a much larger scale in combat than they had been willing to do before because they're out of combat soldiers. They're actually at the point where they're beginning to have to cannibalize their existing divisions to make up replacements for their losses, which the British, by the way, had been doing for the previous 6 months. That's how bad the manpower picture was by early 1945. We were kind of out of Schlitz. All the people who could be deployed were deployed. All the people who could be sent into combat were there. And we were, fortunately, the war didn't last a whole lot longer from that perspective. So the 100-division gamble turned out not to be an easy gamble. We got kind of lucky on some things, including some of the patterns in the way the fighting went and some of the ways in which we compensated for a relatively light and lightly equipped army. But they're making a lot of conjectural judgments, some of them based on accurate guesses, some of them based on inaccurate information, like about the German program, or inaccurate guesses. And that's the compound that they're dealing with. So all I wanted to do today is do two things. First, I wanted to tell you a historical story that I think is kind of interesting in its own right. And then second, since that's presumably a story that we Americans should feel like we understand extremely well, to then relate that as how you would reason from history about any other case study you care to name, which we're bound to understand less well. And I'll stop there. Open the floor to your questions.
You can either stay at the podium, or if you like, you can have a seat.
I'd
take
rather
the
stand.
questions. But I would ask everyone who'd like to pose a question to please come forward to the microphone because we are recording this. So Frank, I think you may or may not make it to the front first, but okay. All right, Frank Gavin.
Well, Philip, that was, as always, a tremendous performance. As always, I learned a ton from you. I couldn't agree with you more about the U.S. example and the fact that we need to know more about it. But as I was thinking about your very powerful argument, I thought, are you only capturing half the story here? What you're trying to explain, and I think this is an important part of the debate about proliferation, is why states make certain decisions. And I think you're absolutely on point to say that if we don't really even know our own history of how this happens, how can we possibly speculate, reason from history about others? But there's another aspect of the proliferation debate. I'm wondering about how history should be used here, and that is the effect these weapons have on the international environment and how one should react when a state actually has them. Now, of course, there's a feedback loop here. But while we may not want to generalize about why Iran is making the decisions they're making or why North Korea is making the decisions they're making, it does strike me that we still would want to think about what our reactions would be. And to do that, we would want to have some understanding on how we think about nuclear weapons shape incentives, affect whether it makes the world a more dangerous or a less dangerous place. And I wonder, what role would history have in trying to answer that? And how would that second question then relate to the first, because the second question is really the one that actually matters in policy. The first question, if you're sanguine about nuclear weapons, you don't really care about the decisions used, and what you really care about is how they shape state behavior. And I was wondering what role history can play in that question.
Sure. I think there's a lot of insight to be gained by analyzing the actual history of this dynamic, like the work that some of the work you've published, or Mark Trachtenberg and some others, which is interesting and revelatory. What it does not yield, I think, is a reliable generalization about the likely result in case X plus 1. What it does yield is a family of illustrations of different kinds of reactions and behavior. What it does then do is it enriches your understanding of possibilities. And therefore, thus, it's an extremely powerful source of questions. And so in general, my guidance to students in the study of history is a wonderful source of questions, but it almost never provides an answer to the question of the case at hand. In other words, suggests the questions, but it does not answer them. And actually, the uses of history to answer the question about the new case, the case at hand, is fraught with problems, including the reliance then exaggerating the degree to which you may be relying on your historical knowledge, which actually, as you've pointed out, is most likely axiomatic and flawed, rather than accurate historical knowledge. Because, in fact, one reason that your work and Mark's work is so interesting is because you tend to use words in it like the myth about all these things that are commonly and axiomatically believed almost universally and which are wrong. So that's another reason not to encourage people to rely on historical knowledge to generalize about the next case, since their historical knowledge is likely to be potted and mistaken. But it's therefore another reason to encourage, though, to more effective study of, no, look, actually it can have a lot of possibilities. For instance, if you study the Cold War, you'll find examples where I believe, or even the post-Cold War era, where the acquisition of nuclear weapons has increased risks. I think you'll find examples where the acquisition of nuclear weapons may have decreased risks, which tells me is that there's no certain answers to what it will be in case X. There are a lot of different possibilities. And then you really just need to do the historical work. So the first point is, the analogies suggest questions, but they don't provide answers. They do not produce scientific generalizations. They don't even produce very good probabilistic generalizations, even soft generalizations, in my view. And there are actually deeper philosophical reasons for my conclusion there, which I won't bore you with. But then I'd say another real advantage of historical analysis is actually do the historical work on the country, but do it at a much higher level than we're accustomed to seeing. So I gave you the Iran illustration. So if I wanted to use historical work on Iran, I gave you a concrete example of how I would use it on a specific historical decision we know Iran made. And I think if you actually constructed the best narrative you could of that, with allowance for all the uncertainties and saying, and here, we don't know this, we don't know this, we don't know this. We know that these concerns were in the air at the time among some people, and here's what we don't know, and then wrote a narrative of that, I would find that more insightful than any intelligence estimate I have ever read on Iran. Much of which talks a lot about, Iran's historical traditions or patterns of Iranian behavior, in these kinds of unit-level generalizations, which I tend to distrust, as you can tell. So if I was looking, for example, at why did Taiwan, as I mentioned in an earlier session, why did Taiwan choose not to acquire nuclear weapons in the late 1980s? That's an extremely interesting case about which we do not know very much. We know a little because the American government played a fairly active role in that matter. Why did South Korea, which was embarking, I believe, on a nuclear weapons program, decide not to pursue that program and then discard it? Also, I believe, in the 1980s. I think another really interesting story. Not because it will tell you what will happen in the future case, but I think it would certainly enrich a lot of your knowledge generally, but also specifically about that country. The more you understood about the way the North Korean decision-making world works, the more that would just simply enrich all your analysis of the North Korean situation, partly because it would increase your humility and respect for, well, but from what I know, I need to know more about this. Because I understand that story so well, here's where I need to collect more information. I don't know enough about that institution that I know is playing an important role in this matter, that tends to play an important role in decisions of this kind. And I need to get more on what they think about this now. Who's in charge of that institution, by the way? And where did they go to school? And what's the person's service record? I mean, those are all actually historical questions. Institutional history and personal history, as well as the history of particular ideas, are all extremely powerful sources of insight for the case at hand, when they're not bowdlerized into kind of sort of macro generalizations about entire countries and societies.
Thank you. I've been working on a book on the armistice in 1943 of Italy, so I'm sort of bathed in all the things you've just been talking about World War II. But to take that analogy, if one looks at the Iranian experience in the 80s, 88, I covered the Iran-Iraq War as a journalist. They were essentially defeated. So what do we know about the institutional memory in their national security policy circles about how they're viewing this defeat? And how they're taking it as a situation where they do want to build up a nuclear capability to deter a conventional invasion like this, or what happened when we knocked off their enemy in 91 in a massive conventional victory. Again, we don't know, and your sort of argument about it was sort of focusing it on the Paz d'Iran, on the IGRC, and what they were doing. And again, it's a very interesting thing. I'm not privy to classified information. I certainly have read a lot about what they say publicly. So it raises sort of interesting questions about how you view history coming into these situations. And so I just was curious about your response to that. And then you, as someone who directed the research on the 9/11 Commission, how does that play into our mental thinking in your mind these days when we're viewing these issues?
That's a terrific question, and because it's actually a source of real insight that's usable insight. You see, mainly, since I argue that reasoning from history is the most common form of reasoning in public affairs, often unacknowledged. A lot of what that consists of are we have narratives in our head about the past that then generate axioms of behavior and narratives about how the world works, how things happen, what has happened to us, what people perceive, what is strength, what is weakness, all right? A lot of actually that is not classified secret. What you're basically, see, for instance, you gave the excellent example of what do the Iranians of this particular cadre, this particular group of people, or the circle surrounding, what do they think happened in the Iran-Iraq War? What is their reading of that? Forget what we think happened in that war. What do they think happened in that war? What was their takeaway from it? A lot of that is knowable because they talk and write about this all the time. And you can get a feel for their discourse about this. It's like, here's what their takeaway has been about that. Or another example could be, what do they think about American performance in Iraq? What do they think actually about America more generally and about the way America behaved? What kind of what historical episodes or analogies or axioms are most prominent in their head? Which, by the way, may seem to us to be screwy. Or they may focus on things that seem unimportant to us but seem like incredibly revealing to them. I don't know. But I will suggest that actually a lot of that is knowable without having to break into the most classified information because, see, that's kind of the cultural world of a group of people. This is one of the reasons why I find the dichotomies that people sometimes draw between political history, social history, and cultural history to be so artificial. Because actually, if you do political history correctly, you actually have to unpack a cultural world that is full of all kinds of idiosyncratic beliefs about the world and about facts and about what has happened to them, about what their history has been. That is the only way to really make sense, actually, of a lot of their politics, including, by the way, ours. What words like republic have meant at different times, even in our history. So that's actually a suggestion of really insightful tools to get into their world and unpack their world. A lot of people who've been in that world they actually know a ton of stuff about this that people actually rarely ask them to talk about because it doesn't seem to form actual hard intelligence evidence about what tubes you've installed in a particular warehouse. Which is, we tend to really like to collect on things and stuff. But it's actually, you can actually read for yourself characteristic ways in which the intelligence community writes about Iran, because portions of this material over the years has been declassified. And the stuff that's classified, believe me, is not the narrative about their culture. So you can actually read, and you can get a sense for the style. And you read that and you kind of go, how much do I feel after reading this I really understand the world of the leadership in Iran, kind of what their worldview. And I was very frustrated with this when I was in government. And one of the frustrations is a lot of the people who are working on Iran are actually very smart about Iran. They actually know a ton of stuff. We have people in our government, I believe, who probably listen to Iranian telephone conversations all day, every day. You listen to people's telephone conversations for a while, you kind of learn a little bit about their society. Just a lot of commonplace stuff. But actually, when you talk to people, you can do a lot to recreate their world. When you I would go out of my way to talk to foreign diplomats who'd served in Tehran, who'd be coming through Washington for some reason. Just kind of tell me about political life in Tehran. And amazing the stuff that they will just unpack to you, because they're trying really hard to get you to feel it. And it just turns out that the products that we produce out of such processes, and actually even sometimes in academic writing, I'm afraid, there's a sense that the thermal efficiency of how knowledge is converted into usable product is like 8%. Because it turns out that when you actually talk to the people, they seem so knowledgeable and smart, yet somehow bureaucratically it just doesn't seem to come out. And so the kind of question you were asking is just the kind of question that I also sometimes struggled with.
What about 911 now?
Well, one that,
Impede us in understanding what's going on right now?
well, a little bit, just in the sense of, again, it's the way the questions it suggests to me. I mean, one of the decisions we made in structuring the 9/11 report, which actually at the time struck people as unusual, is that very early on, actually at the very beginning, I said, and of course, a large part of the report will be about al-Qaeda. There had at that point already been a report done on the intelligence community in 9/11, done by the House and Senate Joint Inquiry, that didn't have a page about al-Qaeda. Because we were just investigating the performance of the U.S. government. We didn't have a writ to investigate al-Qaeda. And it's written the way IG reports are written, which, like, here's what you should have done and didn't do. But it's like writing a report. If you read the Pearl Harbor reports, the U.S. government's Pearl Harbor reports, they actually don't spend a whole lot of time on the world of the Japanese. But actually, if you spend time on the world of al-Qaeda and how they saw the world and how this plan was hatched and when it was hatched, that actually turns out to be really interesting, because partly they had this very unusual worldview, to say the least. And what they think about America and what they think about what's vulnerable and what's not vulnerable and what they want to do. You get a sense for their operational patterns. How do people relate to bin Laden? How do their institutions work? How do they recruit operatives? How do they train operatives? How do they vet them and make sure that they're reliable? When these guys show up who are expats living in Germany, volunteering, how did they vet them and kind of decide that, yeah, we'll trust these guys with our biggest and most high-risk operation today? And then when you see how the plot developed on their side, you also see, oh, well, actually, if we had done X and Y, that would have disrupted the plot. Because that would have, like, for example, if we had blaringly publicized the arrest of Zacarias Moussaoui in August 2001, instead of keeping it secret, the way we blaringly publicized, quite inadvertently, by the way, not as a deliberate government choice, the arrest of Ahmed Rassam in December 1999, when he was caught trying to enter the United States to try to blow up part of Los Angeles airport. And that was a huge publicity wave about that. There's some pretty good evidence that if we had publicized the arrest of Moussaoui, they would have canceled the operation. You see, they knew what Moussaoui knew that we didn't know yet. They knew if we tracked Moussaoui, it would link to them, because Moussaoui's money trail turned out to be their money trail. They knew that. We didn't know that. And so, but it would have, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed actually told us, if I'd known you captured Moussaoui, we would have postponed the operation. because we would have thought that our security had been breached. They didn't know we'd arrested Moussaoui, who they thought was kind of a flake anyway, and they just hadn't heard from him for a little while.
Okay. Netra, did, yeah.
The question that was posed online was already answered.
Oh, all right. Okay, sorry. You, yeah.
Hi, thank you very much for the talk. I'm a student across the park at Hunter College in political science. You talked about U.S. foreign policy before World War II, how it went towards attrition, bludgeoning the enemy, and then it decided that it should go towards more leveraging its technology and air power, things like that. In your view, do you think that in your experience in government, this new holistic approach and trying to understand their world, open up the world, do you think that's also a shift in foreign policy? And at what point, when did that happen?
I don't think our government does what I was talking about.
I didn't think so, and I know that I got the sense that that's your approach, and from reading the 9/11 Commission report, it's like.
Well, I tried to give this little anecdote about how I was puzzling over a particular Iran problem that I had to encounter in my service, and which had to do with the Iranian orchestration and provision of the supplies and training of the people to use some particular kinds of explosive devices that were astonishingly lethal and were killing a lot of our people. And we're very much doing this with malice aforethought. And how I tried to puzzle over that, and kind of in this way, and how hard that was. I feel like I got a little bit of insight to that by asking those questions and using those methods, but mainly the institutions aren't trained to develop information in this way.
Would you
And
like
they
to
don't.
see that happen,
Oh,
or
yeah.
do you see that happening at all?
No,
I'm sorry.
no, I don't. I'm trying. Let me pause for a moment and be fair and try to think if I can think of an example where I'm being unfair about it. I've been out of government now, though, for 2.5 years, so I'm dated. No. I can't. Let me give you another illustration of how interesting these methods are. If you do, another really interesting historical case actually is Iraq. We now actually know a lot about Iraqi decisions about weapons of mass destruction programs from 1990 to, say, 2003. We've interrogated a lot of captives. We've captured a number of documents, and there have been some interesting reports that have been written. I haven't done the primary sources myself, so I can't vouch for the quality of the reports. They seem good to me in the Iraqi Perspectives Project and other things. One of them that I thought was exceptionally good, done by a very high-quality retired intelligence officer, he actually asked exactly the right questions. And he basically said, I'm just going to sit down, and it's now after the fact, and write a narrative about Saddam Hussein's world and what people understood in that world and what he understood about WMD as best we can reconstruct it from the available evidence. And that's a terrific paper. And it's not published in a book, but you can find it. I think this is part of the Dulfer report. And so there are people who have the talent to do this sort of work. There are plenty of them. They're just not trained and configured to operate in this way.
Similar to what he mentioned about the shift from focusing on the Army to the technical side, how much do you think that sort of mentality still drives the current military operation, in particular with the drone bombing in Pakistan? Because we always hear about the collateral damage and how much that sort of makes more enemies, but it's still happening, and it seems like it's a self-defeating operation. So why is that still going on in your mind?
Well, actually, at the micro level, and one of the things that I've encountered in my experience is that the problem that we've just been talking about the reconstruction of other people's world, gets much better the closer you get to the field and the more you get to people who are working on particular individuals. So for instance, if you were to go to an embassy and then you were to go to the people in the embassy who, you know, interact every day with a particular office or minister, and it's just like, tell me about this guy, tell me about this office, they know a lot. And they get a lot. Now let's take the illustration that you just offered. People who are working on particular al-Qaeda problems, let's say al-Qaeda in Iraq or al-Qaeda bases in Pakistan, they have now zeroed in on a number of individuals and interactions between individuals for a long time with every asset of the U.S. government that they can muster. And they actually have tried to do a lot to reconstruct the world of a handful of people. So they may have drones, for instance, surveillance drones that just kind of hover over places for a long time and try to just get a sense of who travels with whom, where do people go, what are the ways in which they move, what are the ways in which they meet, when they meet, what do they do, how are operations planned. You get a lot of information after an operation sometimes, and you can reconstruct, okay, that's how this worked. And so what you'll find is close to the field are people who have really quite masterful, detailed knowledge about these particular groups that they have been focused on very hard. Not always the case, but it is sometimes the case. And therefore, when they decide to shoot, sometimes they shoot very accurately. Because they may have had 4 other occasions where they could have taken a shot and decided not to, and that one they did. And that's one reason why, frankly, we broke and rolled up most of al-Qaeda in Iraq, is we gained that kind of mastery of knowledge about the way al-Qaeda in Iraq worked to the point. And actually, interestingly, a lot of the breakthroughs in the interrogations process came after we quit using the bully boy tactics and just began interrogating under field manual rules beginning in 04, 05. And incidentally, we found, we conducted a natural experiment on methods of interrogation, just as a footnote, where we've tried different methods of interrogation against al-Qaeda simultaneously in a double-blind experiment without meaning to do it. This is what scientists call a natural experiment. And actually, we did very well against al-Qaeda in Iraq. And we would, in real time, could get people, they could tell us some stuff that fit 3 pieces into the mosaic, completed the mosaic, and an hour and a half later, you rolled out another raid in the same night. And then rolled out the next node in the network and even maybe the next node after that. And really broke that organization. It's beginning to reconstitute some now as our presence draws down and so on. But the point is that there are people out there who intuitively get these skills and apply these skills in working micro problems. And in a way, these are very valuable skills. If you talk to them, they're very interested in people's histories. It's historical knowledge on the micro scale. Who is this guy? Who did he know? Who's his family? Where did he go to school? Where is he trained? They want to know all that stuff about them. They want to know the personal history. They want to know the institutional history. Just like they want to know the forensic history of the objects they capture.
I wanted to ask you about historical narrative about the German reunification from your book. And one thing I noticed reading your book, but also reading some of the other memoirs from this time, is that, for example, there was a very important meeting when President Bush was in Poland in July of 1989, and he actually signed a military agreement with General Jaruzelski. And as a result of it, he invited the Polish generals to come to a NATO meeting in Canada at the beginning of August of 1989, and then they came to Washington. And that was sort of the first breakthrough in the Cold War, that this was actually the first time since before World War II where they invited these people here. And it was, followed by some of the more conventional arms control understandings that later developed into something else. But I didn't see that in your book, and I didn't see it in Brent Scrowcroft's book. And I think that maybe it affects the historical narrative of then the German reunification, because it was sort of the first breakthrough. And I wonder if you could tell me, Was that a sort of a conscious decision not to include that, or it was secret? I don't know. I mean, I know it was there, and I was there, by the way. But, I just wondered, I think it would affect this historical narrative of the end of the Cold War, but for some reason it was not included, and I want to ask you why.
Well, of course, the first explanation is the incompetence of the author. And all right, so that's the default explanation, is just negligence. The second possibility is, you're right, I was there, and I did have some responsibility for these issues back then. And if I didn't include it because I didn't think it was important. I barely, to the extent, I don't even remember knowing about it. So it registered no impression on me whatever, if I knew about it at all. And since at the time it didn't seem important to me or to anyone in my office at the White House, and I saw no sign that it seemed important to any of the Germans we were dealing with or any other European government we were dealing with on the German issues, I didn't mention it. Now, it could be that there is a whole story there, and if you dig into the story, you'll find evidence that this turns out to really be important, and the Americans just missed it. And the Americans didn't know about it and missed it. Quite possible. We were following, of course, and Bob Hutchings, who is sitting next door to me in the NSC staff, was on the trip with President Bush to Poland and followed Polish issues even more closely than I did. And he didn't wave his hand about it much either. We were very interested in a lot of other things having to do with Poland, which was enormously important. Though I did not think Poland, I think Poland was an absolutely pivotal link in the chain to the erosion of Soviet power and the process that we associate with the end of the Cold War. I did not think Poland actually was a very important link in the chain to the unification of Germany, which is something that Poles were not anxious to see. In that respect, the developments in Hungary were actually much more important in August of 1989. And that was actually mostly stuff that happened between Hungarians and the Germans, not with the Hungarians and us, though we were more aware of it and were playing a benevolent role. But in general, the Poles who played once again a pivotal historical role were, I think it's fair to say, ambivalent at best about anything that would make the Germans stronger or bring the Germanies back together again. And I did end up spending quite a lot of time on Polish issues in early 1990 when their fears became acute.
I had to chuckle a little bit when you made your comment about how one can learn a lot from a country by listening to telephone conversations. The film The Lives of Others came to mind. And I have a question for you, though, about your how do you maintain balance between these two different worlds of history and policymaking? You seem to do a very admirable job at that, and many of my classmates and colleagues would like to do similar things with balancing these two different worlds. So do you have any advice for us?
Well, it wasn't planned. It's all the product of serendipity. It really is. I get asked by students a lot, kind of, you seem to have had some interesting jobs. Can you please now divulge the secret master plan? Because I've been following a master plan for the last 20 years. I've been pretty good at it so far. I just need to know what the next chapter is, please. And I'm a very poor guide. On every point. I was a trial and appellate lawyer before I went back to graduate school, and then after going back to graduate school again, by the way, because I wanted to try doing something in foreign affairs before I gave up on it and went back to my law practice, which I loved, by the way. But I had no idea how to have a career in foreign affairs. I'd never met anyone who had ever had such a career. All of you know much more about this sort of thing than I did. I'd never met such a person. I knew they existed because I saw them on TV and in magazines. And there was a school I found that claimed to teach people in this field from its catalog, so I applied to it, and they let me in. And then I did okay there, and then when I decided, well, if I really want to do foreign policy, I guess I the best way to do foreign policy is to do foreign policy, so I joined the Foreign Service. And how did I do that? I just took the exam. So and then I was always very interested in history, and then I had a chance actually to go into academia, and of course instantly began doing history work, because that was the work I really wanted to do. But the Germany book overlapped a lot with my government work, but after the Germany book, I tried with some effect, in general, to keep my scholarship actually a little bit distant from the work I do on current events. I find that that's important and helpful. I mean, occasionally then, on the 9/11 Commission, I had an opportunity to kind of, if you were approaching this as a scholar, and this had happened 100 years ago, how would you work on this and write about it? And, and that's a useful mental exercise. Even though, I knew lots of people involved in both the Clinton and the Bush administrations. And it's very important to just kind of try to think about them as if they were historical figures in the distant past. Oddly enough, historians tend to actually develop very strong vicarious relationships with dead people. So it's not that being distant from these people means that you no longer care about them and you're not their friends. You actually develop very strong and passionate, sometimes passionate attachments even, where you take sides in their world, that distant dead world. Because you actually mostly live in that distant dead world. Because you travel to that world, that's the world you actually struggle to live in enough that you can interpret it to the people of the present. And so since you spend your time living in that world, you form attachments in it. And so in a way, distance from events is also no sure guide to objectivity about them.
We have a couple of questions from our online audience, Netra. I'm sorry, and you will have the last question, sir. But go ahead, Netra.
well-
Yeah. Why don't you do both of them at the same time?
Sure. Thank you
Yeah.
very much for your interesting lecture. It has definitely sparked some interesting questions in our online discussion, which I was moderating at the back there while we streamed your lecture live. The first question comes from one of the students in our program. Her name is Margarita. The question reads as follows. You mentioned the leveraging of high technology and the perception of strength/advantage of air power. There has been recent discussion of possible airstrikes on Iran's nuclear facilities. In looking at Israel's historical use of air power to strike Iraq and Syria's nuclear facilities, do you think that the international community might be open to using air power to disrupt the Iranian nuclear program? So that is our first question. And then the second question comes from another member of our program who's off doing research as well. His name is Taunton. Thank you for your excellent lecture, he says. Your argument about the role of contingency in the atomic decision in 1942 shows the difficulty of analogical historical analysis for understanding contemporary events. However, you also noted that for instance, Iranian cultural history, a closer look, I believe, could lead to a better understanding of Iranian decisions. Do you believe that historical analysis beyond the scale of contemporary history could assist in better foreign policy decision making? Thanks.
Yes. Let me start with the second question first. Yes, I do believe historical analysis beyond contemporary history can be enormously helpful. I'll give you an illustration of this. It's not my illustration. There is a wonderful book that was written by a woman named Inga Clendenin. I know that I've got the last name right, called Reading the Holocaust. And it's basically a work in which she attempts to really analyze the Holocaust and trying to unpack the cultural world of the people who are doing this and how they made all this make sense to them in critically evaluating a variety of source material about the Holocaust. It's a terrific book and was very widely praised at the time, even by people in the Holocaust field. But interestingly, how did Clendenin get the expertise to come by this? Clendenin's last major work before she did this work was on the Aztec priesthood, basically a dead nation of 500 years ago. But of course, this was a bloodthirsty priesthood with a bloody cult. And she approached it kind of almost as a historian/anthropologist, learning how to interrogate sources, to unpack seemingly exotic and bizarre cultural rituals, sanguinary rituals. And in effect, the tools and techniques that she developed, the sense of empathy she could develop across time to strange subjects, was the enabler for her to be able to write a really important and influential book to understand the Holocaust better. I think there are a lot of the other illustrations one can draw, and again, it didn't, of course, supply any of the answers. She didn't. At no point in the book does she say, "This guy's like an Aztec." No, but it gave her, it enabled her, enriched her ability to ask questions and work with her sources in intriguing ways, and made for a richer account. It improved the quality of thought at the margin. And actually, that's a lot of what you can do. I mean, when I read transnational historical accounts or other things, it's a lot of what I'm just trying to do is open my mind, enrich my understanding, tune me into frequencies that I ordinarily don't hear, that are beyond the range of my hearing. So that maybe I'll hear just a little bit better tomorrow. If you do something that improved the quality of your thought at the margin by 1%, that's a lot. So, and boy, is history a tremendous well from which you can draw your whole life in this way, just constantly enriching the quality of your thought. The first question that you asked was much more a current events question. It was is the past Israeli experience with striking Iraq in 1981 and Syria in 2007 presage something on Iran. Of course, in 1981, the world disapproved of what they did at the time and approved greatly of it much later. In 2007, the reaction of the world to it was actually very interesting. The reaction of the world was basically silence. Eloquent silence. So, but what the Israelis would take away from that, I wouldn't think of that as that's not an analogical point. It's, how do the Israeli leadership, which will make decisions about Iran, read those reactions? They may not read them the way I've read them, but they may, in other words, what is the narrative in their heads now in the way they have now interpreted that recent history? My guess, by the way, is they interpret, the Israeli leadership today interprets both of these episodes as successes and regards the leadership that approved those strikes as wise, as having been wise. You or I might or might not disagree with that appraisal, but if I've just stated a correct judgment, that is now a useful insight for analysis of the next problem. Now, the next problem has many complications and trade-offs of its own, as the Israelis understand very well. But in that sense, you can see that historical knowledge is useful, but the fact that you think you have a historical understanding of what happened doesn't necessarily mean that the people you're examining have the same knowledge and interpret it in the same way. Let me just give you another quick illustration of this, since it's so vivid and powerful. There's been a lot written, for instance, about predicting the fall of the Soviet Union, the breakup of the Soviet Union, CIA's analysis of the Soviet economy, and so on. One of the fascinating works on that literature is, conclusions that I draw from it, is that the CIA got to the point where they understood the condition of the Soviet economy better than Mikhail Gorbachev did. In retrospect, I think, viewed dispassionately, I think that is a correct statement. In a way, they were smarter than Gorbachev was about his own country. Does that help you interpret and assess Gorbachev? No. In fact, it screws up your assessment of Gorbachev. Because from a policymaker's point of view, it's what Gorbachev thinks about his own economy that's going to determine. Now, then you can say, well, he doesn't understand this. We can influence him to do something we would like if we maybe helped him understand something else. Maybe gave him some information or presented him with a briefing or something. Then you can make arguments like that. But it's a really powerful illustration of, in a way, one reason that we were having trouble assessing the Soviet government is because our analysis of their situation was different and superior to their own analysis of the situation.
You, sir, have the last question.
Kind of a follow-up to this question about how you respond to proliferators. If we're in a mode of sanctions diplomacy with respect to Iran and Iraq, what does history tell us about moving up to red line diplomacy? I'm thinking of conceivably ultimatums. And also, could you just briefly, the numbers don't add up on your 100-division army. I was under the impression that there were 12 million Americans under arms in World War II. A 100-division army is only 1 million. So maybe I missed something in the calculus.
Yeah, on the first part, that I'm just going to ask you, trust me on this. The number people have worked these numbers, and it just turns out that to field a combat division that may have a TOE of 14,000, there are 130,000 people behind that division along the chain, going back to the training camps and so on. Then if you kind of do the work on then how many people you have to field, then how many. Yeah, these are combat units. These are not support units. And so what's happening actually in early 45 is they're repeatedly combing through the support units in England and even back in the United States to basically fill out the replacement depots in Paris and find more people to throw into the line. Because they basically run out of combat infantrymen, because we were losing them way faster than we had thought we would. But it is remarkable that you get that the tip of the spear seems so small in relation to the whole size of the spear, but it is a fact. And actually, we ended up only being able we quit creating new divisions in 1944. That's it. We're done. No more new numbers coming out. Last number of divisions hit Europe in the fall of 44. One of them was actually rounded up by the Germans in December. And that was it. And then from then on in the war, it was find replacements and make it up. And then that's why if we were going to do Japan, we were going to do Japan with combat units in Europe, because there wasn't any other place to find them. And literally, the guys who'd actually already been fighting for all this time, I mean, we basically fought our soldiers till they were killed or wounded, or suffered from incurable stress. The first question you had about what do you learn about how to draw red lines and deliver ultimata, as you can tell from my talk, I'm very suspicious of a generalization about this. The generalization I can confidently offer is that red lines and ultimata often don't work. So, and I cannot specify the pre-existing conditions. If you do the ultimata in this particular way, there is an 80% chance that it will work the next time, based on my study of, if you kind of just do the philosophy of science problem here in developing a probabilistic generalization of this kind. So all you can do is you can say, well, sometimes they work and sometimes they don't. Israel has drawn certain red lines that, for reasons that we may not fully understand, have been respected in some cases. But for instance, right now, with a lot of Iranian support, very large numbers of ballistic missiles are being concentrated to rain down on Israeli cities based in the state of Lebanon. So if that happens, what will Israel do about that? Is that cross some kind of Israeli red line? I don't know. So, but the main answer to your question is red lines often don't work, and you then really just have to if I do a red line on this particular place, in this particular time period, on this particular country, do I think I will reduce the risk that the red line will be crossed? Because see, mostly what you're doing is nobody's offering you a guarantee. You're mostly just in the world of I can either raise risks or I can even lower risks. And oftentimes what I do to lower risks creates other kinds of risks. And so usually the art of judgment in public affairs is how I balance the trade-offs among my risks and my management of risk.
All right. Well, thank you again, Philip Zelikow.